Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, after illegally occupying more and more Palestinian land and initiating several wars and killing thousands of people, the regime in Tel Aviv is shocked that the International Criminal Court has said that Israel should be investigated for committing war crimes. Israeli officials can't believe that any international entity would dare question its impunity. Is this the beginning of the end to Israeli exceptionalism, or is it just another show that will end up doing very little to Tel Aviv? Stay with us as we take a look at all of this on this debate.
The International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor says she will launch a thorough inquiry into war crimes against Palestinians. Fatou Bensouda says there is a reasonable basis to proceed with the investigation.
In brief, I am satisfied, 1, that war crimes have been or are being committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. 2, that potential cases arising from the situation would be admissible.
Palestine has welcomed the move by the Hague-based court as a long overdue step. Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki says the decision marks a dark day in the history of Israel. Amnesty International has also welcomed the investigation as, quote, a historic step towards justice. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, however, slammed the ICC's decision, saying the court lacks jurisdiction to investigate Tel Aviv.
The ICC prosecutor has apparently decided not to dismiss outright the Palestinian claim against the State of Israel. This is a baseless and outrageous decision. The court has no jurisdiction in this case.
Israel's traditional ally, the United States, has also condemned the move. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Washington firmly opposes the ICC investigation. In 2018, Palestinians called on the ICC to open an inquiry into all crimes committed by Israel against Palestinian people. They cited Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as its apartheid policy against Palestinians. In March, a United Nations fact-finding mission found that Israeli forces committed rights violations during their crackdown against the Palestinian protesters in Gaza that may amount to war crimes. Analysts, however, cast doubt on the possibility of holding Israel accountable for its crimes, citing the United Nations' incapability to bring criminal regimes to justice.
The UN has become pitifully ineffective in some major areas, particularly in countries ignoring anything in the UN Charter that they signed to be in the UN.
The Gaza Strip has been under an Israeli siege since June 2007, which has resulted in a decline in living standards there. Israel has launched 3 major wars against the enclave since 2008, killing thousands of Gazans each time and shattering the impoverished territory's already poor infrastructure. Human Rights Watch has repeatedly slammed Israel for its shoot-to-kill policy. The leading human rights organization has also called on Israel to end destroying Palestinian homes, saying the practice can amount to a war crime.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, Ian Williams, Senior Analyst, Foreign Policy in Focus out of New York, and Frederick Peterson, Senior U.S. Congressional Defense Advisor out of Washington, D.C. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start it off with Frederick. In Washington, how significant is it in your perspective that an international entity has said that there is reason to investigate Israel for war crimes?
I certainly think that it is not insignificant. It is, in fact, a world event that this ICC, which is recognized, subscribed to by 123 or so members of the United Nations, has chosen to investigate war crimes. No one should stand up and raise their hand and say, we're in favor of war crimes. Certainly not. The definition must be well-defined and commonly accepted and rational and just. The prosecution of those crimes must be rationally done on high standards of justice and fairness. And the members on both sides of the charges must properly recognize a common forum of dispute. And the problem, the fundamental problem here is that neither Israel nor the United States has recognized the authority of this court to proceed.
Yeah, why do you think that that's the case, Frederick? Now that you've brought up that point, why do you think that that is the case, that basically neither, as you said, the U.S. nor Israel want to even recognize the legitimacy of the ICC?
I think there's a suspicion that there may not be fairness here, that there may be a one-sided influence or intimidation on the part of parties to the decisions and the direction of this court. When crimes against civilians particularly, and crimes against peoples in a generic sense, are being committed, there certainly should be a forum to address injustice. But as we have already discussed, or have tried to intimate, that this forum must be commonly accepted. So the important thing is to form the basis of acceptance and mutual trust and reaching for a common goal before it can proceed. A forum that is not accepted and attempts to prosecute parties that are not justifying its own legitimacy runs in very grave danger of being weighted against those parties which are not parties to the fundamental authority and legitimacy of the court.
Okay, so let me get Ian, stay with me, Frederick. Let me get Ian on this conversation. Ian, your take on what Frederick has just said, because he talked about if you have these entities, then basically that doesn't accept the legitimacy of certain organizations. In this case, we're talking about the ICC, and we're talking about Israel and the United States. Then perhaps they will question what this entity may say. So in this situation that we're talking about right now, that the ICC now is questioning Israel and saying there's reason to investigate it further for war crimes and other crimes, what exactly does that mean in the middle of all of this? Does that mean they're just talking, that nothing at the end of the day is going to happen, or how do you see this?
No, because the International Criminal Court has come a long way. I remember when it was started, the American negotiators under Clinton were deeply involved in formulating it, and the other parties went out of their way to accommodate the U.S. and, I believe, Israel was in the negotiations as well. And it was Clinton then signed on for the treaty, only to have it unsigned by George Bush and John Bolton shortly afterwards. And that was because they could see that it would apply. American behavior in Iraq, for example, was culpable and illegal under international law. But remember, this was all against the background of the criminal tribunal for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the Balkans, which for the former Yugoslavia, and they both worked. They found criminals and they arrested them, and the Israelis have been very scared ever since. There have been numerous instances of Israeli officials who haven't been able to go to places. There was one incident where a senior Israeli official landed at Heathrow Airport and was tipped off that he shouldn't get off the plane because he would be arrested on a magistrate's warrant for this type of behavior. So it's already had some effect in that Israeli officials and generals have to check with their lawyers as well as their travel agents before they go anywhere. Because if they go to places where there's universal jurisdiction and where the ICC is accepted, they knew they were vulnerable. That's what's going to happen here. They're going to be even more vulnerable. They mightn't hand themselves over, but they might be confined to Israel and the United States. And look, we've got to remember the background of this is the Nuremberg war trials. And this is where the Israelis are being particularly duplicitous because, of course, they were applauding. They went and sought out Adolf Eichmann from Argentina, from a third country, kidnapped him, took him to Israel and hanged him for crimes committed elsewhere with no legal basis, almost a strong ethical basis, but no legal basis for it. And now they're complaining because people are trying to say, well, look, this universal jurisdiction thing that applied to the Nazis and it applied to Eichmann, it applied to Milosevic and the people in Yugoslavia, it applied to the genocidal regime in Rwanda, it applies to other people as well now through the International Criminal Court. And part of this building of international jurisdiction, the International Court of Justice ruled on the separation wall that Israel built in the West Bank and ruled that it was illegal and in violation of the Geneva Conventions. So there's a very solid case to bring against Israel. The whole question that's so far is the Palestinians, strongly resisted by Israel and the US, got the status of being a state at the UN, and then managed to get the International Tribunal to accept it as a signatory.
Okay.
And that means that anything committed on the territory of a state that's signatory becomes liable for investigation and prosecution by the ICC. And that's what's happened here.
Well, let me get Frederick back in on this. Well, Frederick, is this a sign that there is a transitioning? Because we have seen, of course, we know that in many instances there have been fingers pointed at Israel of basically going against the Geneva Convention and other laws, but usually nothing is ever done. Is this a sign of a change, or how do you see this? How do you assess this? Because usually no international entity, we haven't seen it actually since the existence of Israel, has really held Tel Aviv accountable.
There is a certain, I think we can all here agree, a certain moral suasion that is influential on the world scene when an organization, ICC, representing more than 100 countries and the opinions of those countries, performs an investigation, gathers facts, presents those facts as either violations or exonerations of acceptable or unacceptable behaviors. And then the rub comes when charges are being filed against non-member states to this, or signatories, justifying the legal authority of this entity to do that. There is, as we said, moral suasion. However, the legal argument still must be weighed. And there investigations against others, there are more than 100 going on, that are, and others are well underway, and people have had arrest warrants issued by this. A problem comes when you have the weight of a country, a minority, a very small, much smaller country. You spoke of Serbia, the issue in Serbia. Yes, but Serbia, there was a gathered force against Serbia, and the presentation, I'm just making the counter-argument, in the case of that was that all facts were not sufficiently heard, and there was a gang of states rather than a collection of, shall we say, justice prosecutors that decided the conclusion and then found the facts to fit the conclusion. Okay. We're afraid that the same thing may happen here, and the subscription is essential of all parties before that government entity, that in this case international government entity, the ICC, can proceed to prosecute.
Sorry to interrupt you, Frederick, but based on that logic, then any entity, sorry, Frederick,
yes.
But based on that logic of what you're saying, any entity that is actually not going to abide by international law, then why would they actually join or sign on to any of these international entities when they know that they are some of the worst culprits and going against the law in the world? So why should they then sign on because obviously, according to what you're saying, they can basically ignore then whatever these international entities, whatever conclusion it comes to, and perhaps is against them. So why sign on to begin with?
Well, you make a very good point. There would be no point in signing on if you thought conclusions were going to be reached adverse to your interests or adverse to fact and justice.
Okay, let me get Ian back in on this. I mean, Ian, it's a lot of different things going on here because on the one hand, we know that the ICC, of course, the funding comes from member states, and on the other hand, as our other guest was talking about, basically these entities who don't want to sign on, don't sign on, and at the end, perhaps the verdict will not be abided by. So my question is that at this point in time now that the ICC has talked about this and has pointed out possible war crimes being committed by Tel Aviv, how likely is it that the ICC is going to face a tremendous amount of pressure now from Tel Aviv and from Washington?
Well, Washington's already threatened to ban any member of the ICC from coming to the United States and therefore to the United Nations in New York, which is incidentally breaks international law under the Vienna Conventions. They can't ban people with UN passports, but they're proposing to. And this is the whole point. Once again, to defend Israel, the US is acting as a global scofflaw. Remember that treaty was very carefully drawn up, so the crimes committed on the territory of a signatory state were prosecutable by the court. So, yes, the US could kill as many people as it liked within the boundaries of the US. Israel can kill as many Palestinians as it likes within inside the US almost, within inside its own boundaries. But the only legal question here is the status of the Palestinian territories. Now, Israel keeps maintaining, and the US is now supported, these are disputed territories. The rest of the world considers it indisputable that these are Palestinian territories. It's been said so very often by the Security Council and the General Assembly. It's been ratified in international agreements. And so the behavior of Israel there has been in violation of international law. Only the Israelis, and until recently the US, has disputed that. So they're not going to get very far with that argument. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And if the ICC prosecution comes up with arrest warrants, obviously they're not going to get them to trial in the near future. But if it comes up with arrest warrants for Israeli personnel involved in these events, then they are going to find it very difficult to travel anywhere. They'll be subject to an international arrest warrant almost anywhere except in Israel and the United States. And that is where the teeth of this judgment comes in. Mm-hmm. It's a warning shot to Israel about its behavior. And remember, this treaty only applies to crimes committed after it came into effect. There was no retrospection, because the British and the French and others with an imperial past made sure of that. So it is only subsequent crimes. So everybody who's committed a war crime, and the Israelis know they're committing war crimes, they really do. They have whole legal teams arguing their way out of it in a very Talmudic and Jesuitical way to getting around fine points. But they know that they're risking prosecution. And they've carried on with impunity because they felt with the US behind them, there'll be no consequences. But there will be consequences. And the consequences are coming because slowly the wheels of international justice are grinding on. And it's become unacceptable in the modern world for people to commit massacres, whether on their own territory or others. I mean, you remember that Myanmar, Burma, is under investigations are being called for into the massacres of the Rohingyas. There's events in Syria are under scrutiny. But there's a double-edged sword here that Hamas and the others who have welcomed this investigation, it also applies to their behavior if they commit war crimes. And, if the Israelis took part, they could well say that a missiles being fired at civilians indiscriminately is a war crime, because it is under international law. The fact that Israel and the US do it as well doesn't exonerate the Palestinians from the reciprocation on that law. And the ICC has been fairly impartial so far. In the criminal tribunals, I have to disagree with my colleague there. In the case of the Balkans, the criminal tribunal there paid for the defense, a very long, involved defense on behalf of Milosevic and the other criminals who were Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks, all brought up there. The Kosovars all went to that tribunal. They all got their defense paid for. It was done under the scrutiny of the world. Okay. The facts were out there and argued. And so, I mean, despite the people who still think that Milosevic was a saint, so anti-imperialist saint instead of a kleptomaniac thug, there's very few people who dispute that justice of sorts was done.
Okay.
In fact, if there's any...
Sorry to interrupt you there, and of course we're going to have to keep an eye on this latest case of the ICC and see where it goes and if Israel will be held responsible. I appreciate both of you being with us for this debate. Ian Williams, Senior Analyst, Foreign Policy in Focus out of New York. Frederick Peterson, Senior U.S. Congressional Defense Advisor out of Washington, D.C. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself right here in Tehran, and for all the crew here. Hope to see you next time.